Hi, guys. Thanks for coming. I know you have a lot of choices. So I'm Alana, and I founded Radish Lab, which is an interactive agency based in Brooklyn and now also just in Berlin. We're opening an office here as well. And today I'm going to talk about how to kind of visualize and storytell with your data. How many of you guys are data scientists? Okay, a lot of you. Journalists? Nobody. What are the other alternatives? Creatives? Developers? What do the rest of you guys do? Oh, analyst. Okay. Business. Okay, cool. This is Radish Lab in Brooklyn. And we say that we focus on good design for nice people. And basically that just means that we work predominantly on social impact projects. We work with a lot of nonprofits, a lot of science organizations, educational institutions, and a lot of people with data. And we really do believe that kind of through storytelling and good design and technology, we can kind of facilitate sharing more information and kind of helping organizations communicate better to solve more problems around the world. These are some of our clients, and a lot of them have great data. And so today, what I'm going to do is kind of walk you guys through 3 case studies of projects that we've done at Radish Lab with clients who've brought us data sets, and for better or worse, we've kind of worked through them and tried to figure out how to visually storytell. But I'm just going to start out by kind of asking you guys and talking a little bit about what I think a data story actually is. So it's not, in my opinion, but this is definitely the beginning of a data story. And so most of you guys are probably familiar with the Excel sheet of data, and this is kind of where it all starts to some degree. And if you're the owner of a data set like this, you probably know there is a story in there. You just don't know how to find it, or you don't know how to tell it. And so often when we get a project from a client, they'll bring us this as kind of like the first thing, and they'll say, this is like there's an amazing story in here, we just don't know how to visualize it, can you help us? At its very core, a visualization, a story, is just taking those numbers and making them into something pictorial. This is super basic. You guys have all done this before. But there's all sorts of new ways of visual storytelling that I think are really fun, and kind of with the birth of the infographic and the popularity of that and data visualizations and kind of like the buzzword of storytelling, I think that there are so many cool examples on the internet. This one I just pulled off from the internet. It shows how big animals' brains are in comparatively to their body size. And as you see, you don't even have to look at the numbers to get a sense of what's going on here, even though this is based on, data that shows brain size and that sort of thing. This is one of my favorite, very simple data visualizations. It's just a GIF, and it's based on a pretty basic set of population data in the US, which shows the most popular baby name in every state over the course of about 20 years. They also have one for men, which is super interesting because people name their babies after the presidents. So you can really see who is in office based on the baby names. But it is pretty amazing how, first of all, how popular Jennifer was in the 70s and 80s, and then also how such a simple concept, which is just basically census data, can turn into this thing which actually feels very personal. And are any of you guys Americans? Okay, yeah, and so it's kind of like one of those things where I'm sure you all have a bunch of friends named Ashley if you were born in the 80s, and unfortunately, Alana was not a very popular name, but most of us can see ourselves in visualizations like this. This is an amazing website, and if you guys haven't seen it and you like the Olympics, you should check it out. It's called olympicstory.com. I don't even know who made it. I should probably know that. But it's basically this incredibly immersive, beautiful, interactive website that uses all the data from kind of every Olympics in the history of humankind and puts it together in this really digestible way. So this is just a view of Torino. And it shows you how many women, how many men participated, how many participating countries. This is 2006, so it's not super like, there's some very early Olympics where like 2 women participated or something like that. But what's cool is it takes a bunch of data over a period of time, presents it in the same way. And when you're on this website, which you guys should totally go and visit, you can kind of dive in and immerse yourselves into this experience and really kind of consume this data that would have normally been in a spreadsheet in a super visual way. So you guys all have data, and some of you quite literally have data because that's how you work and what you do all day. But for those of us who don't work in data every day, one of the biggest things that we're always telling our clients is that you've got it too. And so this is actually data that I pulled from Radish Lab. This is a timesheet report for this week. And so this is a great little like tool that we have. You can see some people are not working that hard, and some people are working super hard. But basically, I can use this to see how many hours people on my team are logging, who's burning out, who's not working enough, who's not logging their hours. And this is just simple data that I use every day as the principle of my business to kind of make decisions. So you all have it. It's just kind of knowing where to find it. When you're thinking about telling stories with data, one of the biggest things clients kind of whine about is like, oh, well, we don't have any big data to work with. You don't need big data. Small data works too. And this is a really good example. This is not complicated. This is like based on somebody logging how many hours they work a week. Big data is like millions of data points. Small data is just basically clearer version of big data, in my opinion. I'm going to walk you through 3 of these case studies that we've done so you guys can kind of learn with us a little bit. All 3 of these examples that I'm going to show you are not perfect, and that's part of what I think is really important to share about the creative process. This was like the first one I'm going to show you is the first one we ever did, and so it's by far the worst. and I'll be very candid about that. We learned a lot kind of through these projects, and we continue to learn as technology changes, as data changes, as approaches change. But as we've gone through this process, wow, that's a really bad color on that screen. We have kind of 4 things that we stick to as we develop these stories. So the first is before you even start to think about what you're going to visualize, just clean up your data. So make sure everything's formatted correctly. Have somebody go through and make sure the commas are in the right spots. Because when you actually start to visualize, that's really going to enable you to see things clearly, literally. The second thing is to know your audience. And so a lot of the challenge of, I think, communicating data, especially to a public audience, is that the data that you guys have collected is hyper complex. And so part of what you have to do is understand who your audience is and what they're interested in, so that when you go to break down that complex data and present it in a simple way, you know what those people are going to be into. Figure out what the point of your story is. I had a really interesting conversation with this guy from VW a couple months ago who was like, oh my gosh, we have all of this data that comes from cars, because cars are now basically like completely computerized. And so there's like 8 million data points that are coming from a car every day, and you've got the temperature, and you've got the windshield wipers, and you've got the engine, and you've got the speed, and you've got the... But he's like, we don't know what to do with it. What's the story in there? And I don't know. That's the question. That's what you have to figure out, is there's a car producing like a bajillion data points, but why is that interesting? And how can you figure out what the story is in there and distill it out? And then the last thing that is super important is to think about how to personalize it. So, you guys all come from different backgrounds, and I'm not a data scientist and not particularly scientific myself, but you can make this stuff interesting to anyone if you think about how to kind of make it relevant. And that's the hardest part, for sure. So do you guys know Eventbrite? I think you had to maybe buy your tickets through Eventbrite. Perfect. So Eventbrite has, as you can imagine, a lot of data. There are people using them all over the world. There are people buying tickets through them. There are people who are like registering and checking in through them. So they've got just like so much data. It's incredible. And it's kind of cool when you think about all the stories that you could find in there. They came to us and they were like, we want to tell a story about how people in America are spending their free time. So the gist was they had these kind of 4 main categories: music, fitness, food, arts. They were like, we want to visualize kind of where people in the US are spending their time, which cities have the most activity around these different places of culture, how cities stack up against each other. And so this was kind of the ultimate concept that we came up with. This is a little GIF that I made someone put together for me, just so you can see some of the interactions. For the sake of time, I'm not toggling out of this presentation because I always run into problems getting back in. But these are all interactive content pieces, so the idea is that when the user's in there, you're clicking around, you're kind of revealing information yourself. What we learned from this one is that we really needed to narrow this story more. It's quite complicated, and there's a lot of data going on here. There's a lot of information and text for people to consume, and we should have kind of thought more about exactly what the story and takeaway was. The second thing is we basically have this intro screen to introduce the interactive, and that's the first thing that people see before they're able to kind of like click around in the map. If you have to explain how to use your interactive data piece, your content piece, it is not intuitive, and it should be intuitive. That is a good user experience. And so as much as possible now, going forward, we try not to get into a situation where we're like, oh, let's have a tour where it's like, here's how you use this complicated visualization. Click over here, click over here. It's really like people should be able to figure that out, and then you know you've got something that's easy to use. And ask why people will care. I mean, it's like, I guess it's interesting how people are spending their time in the US, but it's not necessarily something that I'm going to spend a lot of time figuring out. What might have been better on this one is if we'd actually figured out how to make it so that you could compare how you stack up to the American population and how you're spending your time. And then, this is like some really savvy design advice. Just squint at it. Squint at your like design or your content, and really ask if you can make it out when you're squinting. Can you get the concept of what's going on if you're just squinting at it? I don't think you can with this one. It's too complicated. And most of us don't have the energy or the bandwidth to actually figure that stuff out. This is a big think tank in the US, and they are pretty hardcore with their data. So they came to us with a data set that had energy production and consumption data for the US, Canada, and China. And they were like, we think this is a pretty amazing story comparing how all 3 of these countries consume and produce energy differently on both a country and a per capita basis. I think the data set had over like 100,000 points of data. We actually spent 1 year just culling the data set with them because they were unwilling to really accept that like some of this data was not going to make it into the story. It was just too complex. Ultimately, we produced something that was, and the other thing was the audience for this is pretty high level. So it's a lot of policymakers and economists in the US, or I guess anywhere. They were gearing it kind of towards the US audience. But the gist here is that there's a bunch of different filters that you can toggle on and off to basically produce the same graphing interaction. So as you toggle between the total population and the per capita population, you start to see a lot of differences. And this is a basic visualization of some extremely complex algorithmic data. What we really wanted to do here was make it easy for someone like me, who doesn't know anything about what a metric ton of energy is, to understand. And so here we kind of like actually just told people it was about, what it would take to run all the laundry machines in the US for 30 seconds. We also asked the client to kind of agonize over their data and tell us what these wow factors were. So really, if a user only had a couple of seconds to take something home, tell them why it's interesting. Like, actually just tell them why it's interesting. And so another reason why it took us so long to do this project is because the client had to kind of figure that out for themselves. Sometimes you have to work for your story. We worked a year for this story, which is a really long time. And part of that was because we were wrestling with the client a lot to try and get them to kill their darlings, which is kind of the next point. And a lot of you guys are working with data that you have worked on for years. You worked on that. That's your project, your baby. There's a story in there, but you might not be able to include it all at the same time. And so you don't have to be unscientific. You don't have to be inaccurate by taking your data out. That's not necessarily what's going to happen when you do that, if you're doing it right. You're simplifying so that the story can be digested by the people that you're presenting it to. Another thing that I think a lot about when we're kind of putting together the user experience for data stories is this rule of 6, 30, and 60. So we generally say that on the internet, you've got about 6 seconds to hold someone's attention. And that's actually like a really long time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like most of you are already like clicking somewhere else, I think. And so when you think about it, like 6 seconds is a long time on the internet. And if you've got only 6 seconds to capture someone's attention, what are you going to show them? It has to be really cool. And it's got to be something that they like understand, that they're not like, oh, how the fuck do I use this thing? It's got to be like, no, this is how you use it. This is what we're trying to tell you. This is why it's cool. Keep clicking. Spend 30 seconds. 30 seconds is like a lifetime on the internet. Then what are you going to show them? What's the next piece of information you're going to deliver? And so we really try and create these structures when we're working with clients who have data to ask them, what's the number one most interesting thing about this data set that you want people to consume? Put that up front. Then the second most interesting thing is the second thing that they digest. And then this idea of a dinner party takeaway. You guys all go to dinner parties, maybe, or you have dinner with somebody. And I always think like we're bombarded by internet content all day long. And what's that like, what's that super cool thing you're going to bring up at that dinner party and be like, you'll never believe it. I looked at this great piece of content and it said this, this, and this. And that's what you want to kind of make it very easy and memorable for people to take away. This is the last one. Whew, never spoken so fast. Okay. So Climate Central is an organization in the US, and they basically do climate science research and reporting. They're nonpartisan, and they have a very interesting audience, as I'm sure you can imagine, because there's a huge sector of the American population who does not believe that the planet is warming. And so, I know. So Climate Central came to us and they were like, hey, we've got this amazing data. We got temperature data for 1,001 cities in the US, and we've got data for how hot it is now in these cities, and we also have data for how hot it's going to be in about 80 years, and it's pretty amazing. What's cool is these 1,001 cities represented about 40% of the US population. So 40% of people in the US lived in these cities, or live in these cities, which is pretty good for data representation. This is the interactive that we ended up producing. It's just a screenshot, so it's not interactive. But the gist is that we just ask people a simple question. Type in where you live. You can also click around if you're not a typer. But what's kind of very intuitive about this is we all live somewhere, and the better thing about this interactive is that 40% of the population lives in one of these cities. So chances of us hitting somebody who lives in one of these cities is pretty high, especially because they're like major cities in the US. When you type in your city, this interaction occurs where the map zooms in, it changes color, and it shoots you down to kind of like the city where you're going to be experiencing the same level of heat. This is a really good example of a successful content piece. It had, in its first 2 days, over 3 million views on the internet. Part of it is because it was very easy to make relevant to people. So, maybe I live in Boston, but my mom lives in New York, and my sister lives in Cincinnati, and you can kind of like type in and share. We also made this an embeddable iframe, which is super... It's super important, and that's something, I'm like not a super technical person, but I do know enough where basically an iframe lets you take that content and embed it. You can pull an iframe and put it on your blog post. So we got picked up by Mashable and the New York Times and the Atlantic and the Wall Street Journal. All of these places were able to kind of take this interactive content piece, put it in their blog post, write a story about it, and we can track those hits through analytics and kind of see where the pickup is happening. But the New York Times gets the benefit of like having this content piece and basically being able to like use all of our hard work and effort. So simple really can be beautiful in a sense that there's not a lot going on here, and we actually had part of the popularity of this interactive was from climate naysayers basically saying like, this is bullshit. Like, there's not enough data here to prove that like any of this is actually going to happen, which is interesting. But at the same time, the original data for this story was linked to in the blog post of the client where we publish this piece. Timing is important. If you're going to produce data visualizations and content that you want to have picked up by people, this is an interactive about how hot it is. We launched it in the summer when it was really hot and people cared about that stuff. Personalization is king. That is like probably the #1 thing that we learned from this one. It was like, oh, you really can't just like put out a bunch of data and visualize it and be like, hey, check out this cool study on energy I did. You have to think about why it matters to all of these different, people in your audience. And this one really did that well. In fact, it was the only way that you could really interact with the piece, was to kind of think about how your perspective on which city you were going to view. And then the technical approach matters. So if you're going to spend the money and the time to actually visualize something, and you're actually going to do it well, instead of just kind of doing like a, not that this is bad, but like a bar graph in your annual report or something like that, if you're going to spend money on producing an interactive content piece, think about the technology that you're using and how you're going to make it shareable. Because giving people kind of access, and that was the last talk was talking about kind of like open data and access and sharing and that sort of thing. Basically, you've spent the time and the money to produce these content pieces, share them. You still get the credit. Your name and your logo are on there, but you can also track kind of how people are moving through those experiences. So, last takeaways. Really think about how to make it easy, because a lot of our clients are kind of nerds who are really, really smart, and they're like, but this needs to be high level, this has to be scientific, we can't dumb it down. And it's like, no, we're not going to dumb it down, but we're just going to make it easy, because even if you have like a PhD in, I don't know, biomedical informatics, it's still nice to have something be easy and fun and cool. Identify who your audience is. So really know, are you going for policy stakeholders? Are you going for the general public? Are you going for people who don't believe climate change is happening? Those are all very different people. Simplify and streamline. Really think about those, the thing you want people to take away in 6 seconds or less. Put that up front. And then know what those are. So identify all of those. I usually do like 1 through 10. And if they make it all the way to number 10, you've done a really good job. So go get them. That's it.